Today on the Backyard Brewer, we're brewing a Schwarzbier, or a German dark lager. Now, Schwarzbier isn't a style that I've brewed before. It's something new for me, so this is going to be a first. From the BJCP notes, it needs to be a dark lager, so lagers need to be very crisp and clean. And the darkness needs to be in the colour. It needs to be quite clear in appearance. But you want it to have that nice dark flavor, those nice dark notes to the flavour without being roasty. So you want to get through those dark malts, but not get the real roasty, dark, coffee type notes that can come through with sometimes with darker lagers or with darker beers. Now, I've taken a look at how to brew this. I've read some articles on how to brew this beer. I'm doing this as a baseline. This is going to be a competition beer for me in a couple of months. We're just before Christmas at the moment. In a couple of months, I'm going to put this into our first mini comp of the year for the Brew club that I belong to, just to get a baseline and see how it goes. And then after that, I'll start to adjust it and take on some of the feedback that I get and make this an even better beer. So I know that a lot of people say to put your dark malts in towards the end of the mash. I'm actually going to brew with them throughout the whole mash just to make it simple. Is this going to be a mistake? Potentially, but I'll get that feedback and I'll see how it goes. And then the next iteration of it, I'll make some changes based on the feedback that I get. So without any further ado, let's take a look at our recipe.
Schwarzbier as a style is a black beer. It's literally German for black beer. And if we have a look at the BJCP style guidelines, you'll see that it's a dark German lager that balances roasted yet smooth malt flavours with moderate hop bitterness. Now, what you want from this is you want those dark malt flavours coming through, but what you don't want is any of the roasted malt flavours coming through. So you want to taste the darkness of the malt. You don't want those roasted coffee, chocolate style flavours coming through. So this needs to be a very clean, very crisp style of beer. The appearance should be medium to very dark brown in colour. The aroma is low to moderate malt with aromatic malty sweetness, and hints of roast malt can be apparent. Moderate to low spicy floral or herbal hop aroma is optional. It needs to have that clean lager yeast aroma. And same on the palate, it needs to have that clean lager flavour to it, the clean lager mouthfeel. Okay, so this is a dark lager. It's brewed with a lager yeast. So you need to have it fermenting at those low lager temperatures. So coming into our recipe, we're going for a batch volume of 85 litres, so we're doing this in the big brew house. 85 litres will give me 4 kegs of this once I'm finished. Once you allow for true loss and fermenter loss. So 4 kegs should get me through a little while, although I imagine that being a lager and being a dark beer, 2 of my favourite things, this isn't going to really last all that long. Looking at the malt bill, so we've got 9 kilos of German Pilsner malt going into this. That should give us a lovely, clean, crisp flavour. We're throwing in a little bit of Munich malt for body, 7 kilos of Munich malt. 1 kilo of Carafa Special 2. So the Carafa Special 2 is dehusked and it's got an 1100 EBC. So that's going to give it a lot of darkness. And I'm also putting in 700 grams of melanoidin malt. Now, the melanoidin malt will give this a lot of body. and you can substitute melanoid and malt in when you're not going to do a step mash, or when you're, sorry, a decoction mash. So I'm not going to do a decoction on this. At some point I will do a decoction on one of these German style lagers, but not on this one, not this time, not on such a big batch. Maybe I'll do it on a smaller batch one day. But instead of doing that decoction, which gives you a lovely thick mouthfeel, it gives you, it's hard to explain until you've tasted it, but what it does is it really adds some body to the beer. As far as hops go, I've got two different types of Hallertau hops going into this, and that's because I've got 130 grams of hops that are opened. They're at 2.8% alpha acid, and to that I'm adding 75% of an unopened packet, which are at 4.8%, and that gives me roughly 22 IBUs, which is what I'm looking for from the 60-minute boil. And then into a hop stand, I'm adding Pearl at 8.2% for 15 minutes, and that'll give me another 4.7 IBUs. And that gives me a total of 27. So that's going to give it that moderate hoppiness that we're looking for. As I said, we're using a German lager yeast. We're using the Mangrove Jacks M76 Bavarian lager strain. That does need to be fermented at low temperatures, although I'm going to, because it's an Australian summer here, I'm not 100% sure I can get it down to those really low temperatures. So in addition to using the glycol system, I'm also going to ferment under pressure to try and suppress some of those estery flavors that I'll get if I can't quite get it down to between that 9 and 11 degrees Celsius mark. The water profile that we're going for is 78 parts per million of calcium, 3 of magnesium, 72 of sodium, 101 of chloride, 63 of sulfate, and 188 of bicarbonate. Now, one thing that I have noticed since I've gone to the RO system is that the water profile, after the mash has been on for 10 minutes, I'll take a sample, let it cool down a little bit, and I'll do the pH. And I'm finding that it's all very acidic. So the average profile that I'm getting off this RO system when I do that test is around about 5.1 to 5.2. So I'm finding I'm having to add more bicarbonate in there to bring the pH of the mash back up again. It's not ideal, and I'm going to do a little bit of research on water profiles and other ways that you can bring the pH up without necessarily adding that bicarbonate in, because adding the bicarbonate also adds sodium and could potentially give you a bit of a minerally flavour. And we want to avoid that. Lagers you want to be nice and clean, although dark lagers can have a little bit of salt in there. You do add a little bit more of these salts in there to a dark lager, just to support that darkness, that dark malt that those flavors that you have. You want a little bit of minerality in there just to support the body of that. But there are probably other ways, and as I said, I will do research on that over the next couple of weeks, and I'll produce an episode just on water conditioning and different ways that you can treat water and different ways of bringing your pH up or down. Bringing it down is fairly easy. A little bit of acid, either citric acid, or you could use phosphoric acid, although that's not ideal. But yeah, citric acid. There are other things that you can add. Cream of tartar can give you an acidic mash as well. But yeah, we'll do a special on that at some point in the future. Now, in order to get that water profile, remember, if you download this recipe, adjust for your own water profile. Plug your own water source in there, and then use these values as your target. Adjust your volume, and that will adjust your salt additions that you need to add. There's a lot of salt additions going in here, and that's because I'm using a lot of water. If we go up to the top, our pre-boil volume's 94 litres. And what we're looking for is that volume when it comes down to 85 litres to hit those marks. So what we're adding in here into this batch for my needs, for my water, is 19 grams of baking soda, 15 grams of calcium chloride, 2.3 grams of Epsom salt, 6.5 grams of gypsum into the mash, and then 10.2 grams of baking soda, 8 grams of calcium chloride, 1.2 of Epsom salt, and 3.5 of gypsum into the sparge water. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to have to add any lactic acid. As a matter of fact, as I said before, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to add sodium bicarbonate to bring the pH up a little. Now, maybe once I've done some research on water profiles, maybe what I've got to do is get a batch of RO water and measure its pH and then plug that pH into my water calcs, so that I know what I'm starting with. Getting on with it though, our mash is just a straight 68 degrees Celsius mash for 60 minutes. Nothing fancy about this. We're just mashing. We're going to do a mash out at 75 for 15 minutes and then straight into the boil. As I said before, it's a 60-minute boil with a 15-minute hop stand. Once we get the temperature down to 90 Celsius, then we're going to do our 15-minute hop stand. Fermentation, once we get into the fermenter, what I'm finding at the moment is I'm able with my plate chiller to get the water temperature down to about 30 degrees Celsius. That's way too hot for a lager yeast. So what I'm going to do is put it in the fermenter overnight, let the glycol system bring it down to about 11 degrees, 11, 12. That's where I'll pitch the yeast. And then after half a day of sitting there at 11, 12 degrees, then I'll bring it down to 9 degrees and start my fermentation from that point. So what we're doing is a nice cool 9 degrees fermentation at half a bar, about 7.5 psi for 14 days. Remember, this is a lager, ferments cold for a long time. You want it to go low and slow, just like a good roast beef, low and slow. Now I do this standard fermentation profile has a dry hop step in here because some of the lagers I'll be doing over the next couple of months will have a dry hop addition to them. But what I can do for now, just to change this, is I click the pencil icon here and I come to step 2, the dry hop, and I just remove that and save it, and it's adjusted my fermentation profile. So the ramp up, once I've got primary fermentation finished, every day I'm going to bump the temperature up by 2 degrees until I reach 18 Celsius. Once I reach 18 Celsius, it's going to sit there for 4 days doing a diacetyl rest. Diacetyl rest simply is just the yeast cleaning up its own byproducts. So you're giving the yeast, you're warming it up, and you're letting the yeast get in there and clean up their own byproducts, reduce the amount of sulfation that happens, so you don't get that strong sulfury smell that you can get from some German lager styles. Now, sulfur is acceptable in a German lager style, but only at low levels. The other thing that we don't want is diacetyl, so it's going to clean up the diacetyl as well. Then after 4 days at 18 Celsius, I'm going to bring it down by 2 degrees per day until we get down to the cold crash at 1 Celsius. It's going to sit there for 3 days. And then after 3 days on the cold crash, we're going to keg it and stick those kegs into my conditioning keezer, and it's going to sit in there for up to 56 days. Now, I'm not going to wait 56 days. After about 2 weeks, I'm going to taste this. So this is a long process. We've got 14 days roughly of primary fermentation. Then we've got 4 days of ramp up, 4 days of diacetyl rest, 5 days of ramp down, 3 days of cold crash, it's a long process, and then a couple of weeks of lagering before I taste it for the initial batch. But because I've got 4 kegs of this, I'm imagining that the lagering process is going to take well beyond 56 days in the end. This is potentially going to be sort of 3 months, 4 months by the time I get around to the last keg. We're going to have 72 litres of mash water, 33 litres of sparge. That's going to leave the sparge, my hot liquor ton on this will be the little Brewzilla 35. It's going to leave it really full, so there's not going to be a lot of headroom in that. If we look at our stats, we're going for an ABV of 4.9%, so that's the middle of the range for this style. An OG of 1050, a final gravity of 1013. We've got an EBC of 42, so it is going to be quite dark, but not black. We'll have an IBU of 27, mildly hoppy as the style calls for, and a BU-GU ratio of 0.54. So we've still got a bit of sweetness in there, a little bit of sweetness from the malt, a little bit of sweetness from the alcohol itself, and then that mild hoppiness just to counterbalance all of that. So with that, let's get on with our brew day.
While the strike water was heating up, I measured out the grains, then started measuring out salts for both the mash water and the strike water, and then milled the grains. Going in was pretty simple, and with the help of the grain stirrer, I'm finding that mash efficiencies are just slightly up. "10 minutes after mash in, and after checking the pH was in the normal range, I adjusted the recirculation rate to keep the liquid just above the mash bed. Because the grain was nice and loose, sparging didn't take very long at all. And as you can see, the pulley's working out really well for these larger grain bills and making it much easier to get the malt pipe out of the mash tun. I used a hop spider for this brew day, just to make sure that there was no hop material going into the fermenter that might give a slightly vegetal flavour. And in goes the first addition of hops. "15 minutes from the end of the boil, I started running hot water through the plate chiller just to sanitize it. And then added the aroma hops to the hop stand. Once the hop stand was finished, I hung the hop spider up just above the kettle just to make sure that all of the wort drained out of it and I got maximum impact from those hops. I turned on the cold water for the plate chiller, and once the temperature of the wort was down to 30 degrees Celsius, I started pumping it into the fermenter. 30 degrees is about all we're going to get this time of year, given the temperature of the groundwater and all of those things. And then the next morning, once the glycol chiller had chilled the wort down to pitching temperature, I threw in 4 packs of Mangrove Jack's M74 Bavarian lager yeast. And there you can see the pressure cap going on, and everything was sealed up and ready for fermentation. Before we get to the tasting, let's talk about the fermentation of this. Now, it didn't go ideally. I was going to ferment under pressure, 15 bar, which is what my brew belt can take, and still ferment at lager temperatures, so down around that 10, 11 degrees mark. It took around about 2 days for the yeast to kick off, and that was pitching it at 12 degrees. I left it at 12 degrees until I could see signs of fermentation, as in the pressure rising inside the fermentation vessel. And at that point, I dropped it back down to 10 degrees. I was going to do 9, but I thought 10 is probably better, seeing as I'm also doing pressure fermentation. There weren't going to be a lot of esters thrown anyway, but that's just what I decided to do. Unfortunately, about 4 days into fermentation, the glycol pump gave out, and this is the second glycol pump that's given out. So what happened was this fermented very quickly, but it fermented under pressure. I kept the pressure at 15 psi, and I wanted to go as high as I can because I knew out in the Australian temperatures we were getting 33, 34, 35 degree days at that point. I didn't want that temperature impacting the beer. I wanted to use pressure to reduce the esterization and make sure that none of those sort of over temperature phenols and esters that you can get from lager yeast didn't take over the beer. I kept taking samples. I waited until the samples leveled out and I could see that fermentation was done. And at that point, in order to get the beer back down to a good temperature, I had 4 kegs. I filled 4 kegs. 3 of them went into my conditioning freezer, and they'll sit in there for months, so that they'll go through the normal lagering process. This keg has been sitting in my kegerator. I carved it at 15 psi for about 2 days, and at that point I dropped it back to 8 psi, which is my regular serving pressure. It did carbonate quite nicely. Now it's lost a bit of the head, but that's because I've been fiddle-faddling around. I dropped a glass bottle and had to clean that up. But you can see that there's still head present on here. It's a nice tan head. It is long lasting, and that's probably a good 5 minutes since I poured that beer. So the head is good. The carbonation is good. Now the other thing is that 2 nights ago was our first club meeting back, and this beer was judged as part of our lagers. I waited to do this episode until I had that feedback because I wanted to include that feedback as part of this video. It's been conditioning for 4 weeks. Now at first, I could get a bit of a sulfur smell off it, which is okay. Some sulfur on German styles is acceptable. It's just part of the tradition of those beers. You do tend to get some sulfur in German style. That has settled down now, so that's all cleaned up. Now, Gayleen did tell me she didn't like the smell of this beer because it reminded her of Baby Sick. After being judged the other night, I poured one last night and I asked her to smell it now, and she said, no, that's completely gone. So lagering your German lagers definitely does improve them, and the longer you lager them for, the better they'll come out. Now, I do have the results of the judging, and this isn't just amateur brewers who are doing this. We do have BJCP certified judges who sit on every table while the beers are being judged. Now you'll have also noticed that I'm doing this tasting inside today. That's because, in case you don't know where Australia is located, it's about 2 miles from the surface of the sun. It is hot as Hades out there today. It's just gone 12 o'clock and it's already, looking at my weather station, it's already 37 degrees. I'm expecting that we're going to hit 39 today, and it's way too hot to sit outside, even just under shade drinking beer. So let me just go through this. Category 8B, Schwarzbier. What was the feedback I got? Aroma, rich bready malt aroma, dark caramel roast, may be too much. Low spicy herbal, clean ferment character. So that's what I was looking for, was that low spicy herbal from the hops, from the noble hops. Clean fermentation, which this was. I was very afraid when that glycol chiller, messed up, that this was that was going to spoil the beer. Obviously, the pressure fermentation stopped that from happening, so it did get a nice clean fermentation. Plus, the 4 weeks of lagering also helped it. Too much malt, and that gets covered later on in the comments. So too much roast. This beer shouldn't have a dark roast character to it. So for aroma, that scored 9 out of 12. Very happy with that. Appearance, dark brown, ruby highlights, reasonably clear, tan head, 2.5 out of 3. Now, what might it have missed out half a point on? It could have been the carbonation because I was in a hurry the morning that I was filling this. I didn't take my time. I didn't drop the pressure down to pour slowly, so it probably lost a bit of carbonation. And reasonably clear, you can't really tell. It is quite dark. You do get the ruby highlights. It's not a see-through beer, not by any stretch of the imagination. Maybe, yeah, and we'll cover that in a second. Maybe it could be a little more clearer. Yeah, it's 2.5 out of 3, so very happy with that. Flavour, more toffee caramel up front, higher sweetness, residual, and I know that it did finish a little high. I'm not sure why, but dry finish. Low bitterness, low herbal hop flavour. So, yeah, the residual sweetness is possibly where it's missed out on, as well as that toffee caramel up front. Should be going more for the malty character rather than that toffee caramel. 12 out of 20 for flavour. Mouthfeel, medium light. Suggest more carb, low to moderate, so it's a low to moderate carbonation. You can see from here, when I pour this beer off the tap, it is highly carbonated. There are still bubbles rising to the surface there, I can see them, and could be higher for perfection. Mouthfeel, 4 out of 5. So let's just go through that. Oh, it does smell nice. It does have a nice aroma about it. Slightly herbal. You do get that dark malt character rather than just the, sort of that bready malt character. It's not as clean as it could be. The mouthfeel is nice. And that's one of the things that I've noticed since the first one that I poured, is that I think the melanoidin malt that I added has added that rounder mouthfeel. It gives it a lot of body. On the back of the taste, on the back of the tongue, right at the very end, it finishes a little bitter. Now, it could probably go with a little less bitterness. I wouldn't say it's astringent, but it's heading towards astringency. And again, maybe that's from those dark caramel malts, so the Carafa Special 2 that I used. It is dry. It does have dry finish, which is good. The high carbonation helps with that. The high carbonation also helps to reduce that sweetness a little bit. So maybe it wouldn't have scored so lowly if it had have had more carbonation. The sweetness wouldn't have been quite so obvious. So overall impression, really nice, easy drinking beer, lacking in malt character for style. So more malt, less dark malt. Look at recipe for amount of crystalline dark malts used. Well, we went through the recipe. I used the appropriate amounts, but the last comment is, or experiment with adding dark malts in very late mash. So right up front, I recognised that could be a problem. I added the dark malts, that Carafa Special 2, in at the start of the malt. Other people have said add it in 20 minutes from the end of the mash. Sorry, I added it at the start of the mash, not the start of the malt. The Carafa 2 I added at the start of the mash. Other people say add it in, some say 30, 20, 15 minutes from the end of the mash. And that way you don't get that dark roasty character. You just get the colour and you get some of the darker attributes without having that dark bitterness. So stylistic accuracy, close to classic. Not quite classic example, but close. Technical merit, flawless. Intangibles goes between wonderful and lifeless. It's kind of more towards middle or wonderful, not quite wonderful. It scored, what was total score? 34.5. So 34.5 is generally within style parameters, some minor flaws. So for my first attempt, and with what went wrong during the fermentation process, I'm more than happy with this beer. It is very drinkable, especially on a hot day like today. Like I said, it's after midday, so cheers. It's probably not a beer that you would sit on all day, but it is very easy drinking. You might start your day with 2 or 3 of these and then move on to a lighter lager, say a Pilsner or an American light lager, a Mexican lager, something like that. Something that doesn't quite have the heaviness about it that this does. But I do see a lot of these in my future, given that I've got another 3 kegs of it. There are. Now, something that we have done recently, and I have had a bit of a break over Christmas. We've had a lot going on with new foals, with fencing, with storms. We've had some pretty horrific storms here over the last couple of weeks to months. So I haven't been regular with I haven't been as regular with my posting, with my videos as I was before Christmas, but that's all going to change. I've got a lot of material that I have been filming. I just haven't had the time to do the editing and get around to finishing it off. I've also done Mark II of my Schwarzbier to see if I can improve that a little bit. And that's also ready to go into the keg. So that'll go into the keg today. I'll leave it to carbonate, and I'll probably do the finish off of that video next week and come out with that in a week's time. There's some other stuff that I'm playing around with as well. There's a bit of equipment that's coming in. There's some tips and tricks, and just some other information, that I want to share with you. Like I'll be doing an episode on yeast, an episode on hops, an episode on malts, and that's all coming up pretty soon. One thing we have done is I have set up a Patreon. All of the proceeds of the Patreon will go straight back into the beer making process. That's the purpose of the Patreon. Link for that will be below. If you would like to contribute, the contribution amounts start really low. Anything that you give, as I say, will go straight back into the channel and getting regular content out. Now at the moment, because everything's pretty full, I'm also going to do some videos on making rum and whiskey and the distillation process. Now, distillation still isn't entirely legal in Australia. If you're a small producer and producing it for yourself, I think the government tends to not worry about it and look the other way. It's more trouble than it's worth, as long as you're not producing on a commercial scale. I'm only producing 2 litres at a time. It's just for personal consumption. Galen really loves the bourbon that I make, which is based on the Woodford Reserve recipe. I also do a rum, and the rum that I've had in the barrel for about the last 3 or 4 months in a small 2-litre barrel is really starting to come out beautifully now. So there'll be some episodes on stuff like that as well. I won't show the entire process on YouTube because of the legal situation here in Australia, but I will post that on Patreon. So people who subscribe to the Patreon will have access to that type of content. I'll also be doing a lot of behind the scenes stuff on Patreon, showing you what's going on. Just some brief clips from brew days and updates on fermentations and things like that, just so that you can follow along. I'm probably going to use Patreon more so than Instagram or anything like that, just so that the people who are supporting me get the benefit of that sort of thing. As usual, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, click the notification icon so that you find out when we're bringing new content out. Like the video and leave us a comment down below. I do try to get around to all of the comments. I've been a little slack lately because of just time limitations, but things are starting to get back into a regular flow again. So yeah, I'll be paying more attention to that. But of course, as I always say, enjoy the hobby, but drink responsibly.